Meredith Chen, a 19-year-old, breaks out of a government quarantine facility in which she's been kept as the only known person immune to the world ending. Crimson plague that transforms blood into crystal. Recaptured, she works in secret with sympathetic scientists to develop a modified version of the plague virus, one that transmits immunity rather than death, in a higher-risk effort to either save humanity or make the pandemic even worse. Her desperate roll of the dice pays off. The virus is wiped out worldwide, and she goes from convict to the world's sentinel against future pandemics. The alarm was a klaxon which had shattered the morning calm. The way a death knell bounced off of the concrete walls of Sector 7. Meredith Chen's back was firmly pressed to the cool metal of the supply closet door, her breaths shallow and in check, as she counted the seconds between each loud scream. 3 seconds. Always 3 seconds. That indicated that the containment protocol was still in effect, but that something had changed. The pattern was different today. Now she'd been squashed into this small space for close to 18 hours, subsisting on rancid protein bars and reused water from the filtration pack she'd nicked from the medical wing. She touched the identification bracelet on her wrist, the one that identified her as Subject 2847. The one that had saved her life when she was the sole surviving member of her comrades on her sector when the Crimson Plague had hit 3 months earlier. For such an ugly thing, the plague had a beautiful name. It was called hemorrhagic extinction syndrome, the scientists said, but the media had picked up on it, and they'd been calling it the Crimson Plague. That was because it caused blood to thicken into a sort of syrup, a syrup that eventually solidified in the veins. The end was slow to come, and painful, as the body's circulatory system turned into something like ruby glass that could shatter with the slightest movement. Meredith had seen it happen to her younger brother, Tommy, before that. He had been playing basketball in the rec yard when he got his first symptoms, a nosebleed that wouldn't stop. Then the fever. Then there was how his skin was starting to have the transparent quality of stretched tooth and porcelain. She had held his hand as the plague worked its way through his 10-year-old body, only to be forced to watch his blood vessels turn blue and then green with every twitch and tremor beneath his skin until they glowed like Christmas lights before hardening forever. The Chicago quarantine zone had originally been set up around Chicago, and then grown as the plague raged with nightmarish effectiveness. Airborne, waterborne, spread by touch, by breath, by the very air they breathe. The government was quick to cordon off the areas touched by infection, quick to abandon the millions of people trapped inside as the cost of doing business in the war on behalf of humanity. But Meredith had survived, and while her brother had died, while her parents had both grown sick and succumbed, while both her neighbors and friends and every single person she had ever known had been turned into a crystal statue of their former self, she had remained untouched. The plague could not establish a foothold in her body. Her blood refused to crystallize. Her body fought off the infection with such a ferocity that it mystified the scientists who for months had been studying her. The researcher on her case had been Dr. Harrison Vale, a gaunt, anxious man with gentle eyes and hands that trembled when he drew her blood for the 100th time. He'd told her in clinical terms what it was about her that made her special, valuable. Her immune system had generated antibodies that shielded her from the plague and might be replicable as a cure. New line, you're not just immune, Meredith, he'd once said to her during a session. You're the one to stop this thing. Your blood could be used to save lives of millions. She had been willing to help, anxious to be part of the search for a cure that could return to her some fragment of the world she'd lost. But as those weeks turned to months, she began to suspect that the people at the helm of the task force weren't interested in creating a cure. They were interested in her, by keeping her locked up, by studying her like a lab rat, by using her blood and her cells and her hope until all that's left is emptiness. Then all was still again, the eerie silence somehow more disturbing than the noise. Meredith put her ear to the door, expecting to hear footsteps, speech, some sign of life beyond her hiding place. Nothing. The silence went on, dense and stifling, until she started to feel as though she were possibly the only living entity remaining anywhere in the complex. She had been planning her escape for weeks, ever since she heard Dr. Vale arguing with Director Morrison about their work's moral implications. Morrison had been cool, calculating, his voice that of a man who'd already written off the rest of humanity. The girl is the only case we have as a confirmed immune, Morrison told the outlet. We're not going to risk losing her by trying to create a cure that could be faulty. Best to keep her here, keep her safe, continue to study her forever. But what about the people who are not inside the zone? Dr. Vale had protested. The plague is spreading. We have cases in 17 countries now. If we don't act soon, the outside world will have to do it for itself. Morrison had interrupted. Our job is to save what we can save. The girl stays here. Meredith had made up her mind that night. She was going to escape, get to the real world, and make them cure her with her blood. She owed it to Tommy, she owed it to her parents, she owed it to every life that had ended while hers went on. She owed it to the dying world to let it do so while she was holed up in this barren cell. The idea behind the escape had been simple. Every day when our shipment from the dock came up to the research levels, she'd jump in a crate that was headed out. Dr. Vale had helped her, although he would never acknowledge it. A keycard put in the wrong place, a security camera that went down at just the right time, a supply manifest that portrayed one less shipping container than actually left the facility. But something had gone wrong. She was already late to the loading dock when the alarm went off, and she'd had to run to the nearest hidey hole she could find. Now she was cornered, hearing silence and contemplating whether that chance at freedom had in fact slipped from her reach forever. As she heard the footsteps get closer and closer, shivers ran down her spine. Heavy boots on concrete, several series, moving like soldiers. She held her breath as they went past where she was hiding, trying to listen in to their conversation through the heavy metal door. Sector 7 is free of hostiles, someone said. No sign of the subject. Keep looking, came the reply. Morrison wants her found before that transport gets here. Transport. Meredith's heart sank as it dawned on her what this meant. Weren't looking for her alone, to take her back to her cell. They were taking her somewhere else, somewhere she would no longer have an opportunity to escape. The idea of living forever locked in some underground facility, with vampires draining her blood as the world outside died, made her panicky to the point of trumping her caution. She had crouched in wait until the footsteps had died away, and then had very slowly opened a door and crept out into the passage. There was only the menacing read of emergency lighting, and she was like a ghost in the corridors she'd memorized during months of captivity. The loading dock was 3 levels and 2 sectors away. If she could get there, if she could find a way onto one of the outgoing trucks, she might still have a chance. Designed as a fortress, many security layers and reinforced barriers had been constructed to keep things in as much as out. But Meredith had some advantages that the developers had not considered. She was short, quick on her feet, and desperate. She was also more familiar with the routines and patterns of daily life at the facility than most of the guards, because she had spent so much time watching them. Her cell window provided a window on the world. She'd made it to the first checkpoint without complication, sliding past a security door with Dr. Vale's key. The second checkpoint was more challenging, with her having to slither through a maintenance tunnel that ran alongside the main corridor. The space was just wide enough for her small frame, and she fought off waves and waves of claustrophobia as she gently pushed herself along in the blackness. She froze at the sound of voices ahead. She was still 20 feet from the tunnel opening, but she could hear voices in the corridor beyond. She couldn't make out the words of the conversation, but heard enough to realize what was going on. Transport leaves in 30 minutes. Morrison would like her to be sedated for the ride. New facility in Colorado. Deeper underground. No chance of escape. Double quotes Colorado. They were transferring her to a location in Colorado, which sounded more secure than this one. She didn't do it now. She'd never do it. It was the thought that gave her the strength to force herself forward, even after she stubbed her knee or hit her elbow. Crawling through the narrow tunnel, she came out in a utility room with cleaning supplies and tools. The chemical odors were strong, but she had forced herself to fixate, as she had from the beginning, on the task. The loading dock was a floor below, and she could hear the roar of truck engines through the air shafts. Her best option was the service elevator, but it needed a security code she didn't know. She was examining the keypad, racking her brains, for example, of someone using it, when she heard footsteps coming from the corridor beyond. Numerous people, hurrying, talking together in thick whispers. She has to be somewhere in this section, came a voice. The motion detectors detected motion 20 minutes ago. Go through every room, came the response. Every closet, every storage space. She's small enough to put almost anywhere. Meredith scanned the room desperately for some other way. To get out, there were no windows, no other doors, no apparent means of escape. She was cornered, and they were cutting off her escape. Reaching for anything she could, she finally pulled down a bottle of industrial cleaner from a shelf and huddled in the corner as far away from the door as she could. The footsteps stopped right outside. She could hear keys jangling, the electronic beep of a keycard being swiped. The knob turned, and a shaft of hall light filled the room, clear, a voice reported after a rapid visual sweep of the room. "Just cleaning supplies." The door began to close, and Meredith almost shouted for joy. Then it stopped, propped open by a boot. "Wait," the same voice said. "Check behind those shelves." "She's little enough to be able to squirrel back behind there." Meredith pushed back against the wall. She knew it was futile. In seconds, they would discover her, and her only chance of escape would be lost. She thought of Tommy, of her parents, and all the people who had died while she was alive. She considered the millions more who would perish if she couldn't get her blood to the wider world outside. There was a flashlight beam playing over the room, drawing near her retreat. She closed her eyes and braced herself for the fight, knowing she was doomed but unwilling to go down without a fight. The light was almost on top of her as the building rocked from a massive blast. The explosion knocked everyone to the ground. Warning alarms went off, and she could hear shouts and screams from all over the building. The guard who had been looking for her was now on his hands and knees, his flashlight rolling across the floor. Beyond the open door, chaos reigned in the hallway. She did not bother to stop and question what had transpired. This was her opportunity, maybe her one opportunity, and she seized it. She bolted past the groggy guard and down the corridor, which was filled with people running in all directions. The emergency lighting was flashing and she could smell smoke in the air. It was the scene of chaos where she found the loading dock. Multiple trucks were on fire, and emergency crews were working to extinguish the flames. She could not say whether the explosion had been an accident or otherwise, but it did not matter. No one in the commotion observed a slender figure make his way between the cars. In a refrigerated transport truck being loaded up with medical supplies. She found her shot. The driver was assisting with firefighting operations and the bed of the truck was unattended. Screwing herself in among the crates and packages, she shut the door after her. The truck's refrigeration unit had already been on and the temperature inside was barely warmer than freezing. She donned a lab coat she'd filched from the medical wing and made herself comfortable for a long, chilly ride. She could hear the sounds of the chaos outside, but it was gradually becoming more distant as the truck pulled away from the compound. She'd done it. She'd escaped, but as the truck bolted away from the only home she had known for months, she knew the most difficult part of her journey was yet to come. She was an impoverished 19-year-old girl with nothing, no connections, no means, not even any way to prove what she claimed had happened. She was a carrier of a devastating plague that brought death with terrifying swiftness. But she was also a fugitive from the terrifying force that controls the world at the price of brutal torment for the unfortunate. 14 hours driving in the truck. She slept fitfully, waking each time the car stopped or swayed. Her body was sore from the cold and the cramped quarters, but she didn't dare get too comfortable, for fear of moving the load or making noise that could be a turn-off for the driver. After the truck finally came to a stop for an extended period, she was able to hear voices outside. Loading dock laborers. It sounded like getting ready to offload the cargo. She flattened herself against the rear wall of the truck, behind a pile of medical supply cases, and waited. The doors banged open, and warm air rushed to fill the refrigerated space. She could see daylight beyond the workers, who were climbing into the truck to help unload it. True sunlight, not the artificial light of the building. She had forgotten how pretty sunlight looked when it was not artificial. The men were professional and handled the crates with ease. She sat as still as possible while they worked around her, barely breathing, until eventually the truck emptied out, leaving her hiding place. She heard the workers retreat, their voices dimming as they returned to whatever building they'd been unloading into. After 10 more minutes, she cautiously stepped down and crept carefully to the back of the truck. The loading dock was empty, and through a gap in the trees she saw a parking lot and what seemed to be a small town in the distance. She had gotten out of the quarantine zone, but on the way down from the truck, she discovered that not only were they not where they should be, she had no idea where they were at all. The license plates on the passing cars meant she was in Kansas, but she had no idea where she was. She was hundreds of miles from home, with no money, no ID, no plan beyond hoping that someone would sit down and listen to her story. Days were the hardest. She slept in parks and abandoned buildings, foraging for food and water where she could find them. The handful of people she attempted to reach out to shunned her or accused her of being insane when she tried to tell them who she was and what it was that ran in her blood. In the small town of Millbrook, she met Pastor Samuel Wright, an elderly pastor who discovered her sleeping in the doorway of his church. The man invited her in and listened to her story rather than call the police. He didn't at first, but he was kind enough to let her stay with him while he attempted to confirm her account. "So, you're saying you can get me immune from this plague that's killing people across the world?" he said, as he sat across from her in his modest church office. "I know it sounds impossible," she said, exhaustion causing her voice to tremble. "But I have proof. This bracelet, those medical records I stole before I got out. I'm not crazy, Pastor Wright. It's me. I'm the one who can make this thing stop." He pored over the papers she'd handed him, his weathered face drawn in concentration. "These look official," he admitted. "But if you're telling the truth, if you really are who you say you are, then they're coming for you. Men with power that won't rest until they've hunted you." "I know," she said, "but I can't hide forever. Every day I'm running is another day the plague's spreading. Another day that we lose those who could have been and could be saved." Pastor Wright placed a few phone calls to contacts he had in the medical community. After 3 days, he tracked down Dr. Amanda Foster, a virologist at the Centers for Disease Control who had been researching the plague since its onset. Initially, Dr. Foster remained doubtful, but when Meredith gave her actual details of what research was being carried out at the facility, details which had never been published, Dr. Foster started to take her seriously. They arranged to meet at a small hospital in Topeka so Dr. Foster could take a look at Meredith's blood and confirm her account. The blood tests verified what Meredith had spent weeks trying to tell people: her immune system was generating antibodies that could neutralize the plague virus with extraordinary potency. More to the point, it was those same antibodies that could be manufactured and mass-produced, perhaps providing a cure that could save millions of lives. "This is stunning," Dr. Foster said, as he looked at the test results. "It's not that your blood doesn't want the plague, it's that your blood wants to destroy the plague. That way, we might be able to develop a treatment that would halt the infection." "How long would it take?" Meredith asked. "If we had more money and more resources, we could perhaps have a prototype treatment available for testing within a few months. Mass production could start within a year." "A year," Meredith repeated. "How many people would die in a year?" Dr. Foster's expression was grim. "As it currently stands, the plague will reach all continents around the globe within the next 6 months. If the fires and tree deaths continue unchecked, we're not talking about a future extinction event, but one that is already underway." The full weight of that statement crashed into Meredith like a physical blow. She'd known things were bad, but she'd been focused on getting away, surviving, making it to the outside. She hadn't really grasped the dimensions of what was taking place outside the quarantine area. "There's something else," Dr. Foster added. "Something you need to know. The authorities have been searching for you since you escaped. They've designated you a matter of Nat Lemon Bobo Ional security, and there's a pretty hefty reward for any information that results in your capture. So what do? "We move fast," Dr. Foster said, "and we work quietly. I know some colleagues who work at universities and research institutions all over the world who would help, but we need to keep this under the radar until we get some results. When we have a treatment that's effective, they're going to find it much harder to bury this." The following 3 months were a whirlwind. Dr. Foster had secretly ferreted Meredith to a private research installation in Colorado, where a team of scientists toiled day and night to study her immunity and synthesize it. Blind was the soul that was not. She, like Meredith, gave blood to the point of fainting, but never grumbled. Each vial of blood they drew was a step toward a cure. The work was made more difficult by the imperative of secrecy. Government agents were hunting for her, and they needed to be cautious not to draw attention. The research team itself was small, only 5 scientists who had been selected with due regard to their discretion and their loyalty to the project. The lead researcher, Dr. Jennifer Liu, a brilliant woman whose entire family had been decimated by the plague. She pulled 18-hour days, powered by a mix of scientific curiosity and personal grief that rendered her irresistible. She was the first person to manufacture Meredith's antibodies in a laboratory environment to positive effect. "We have done it," she declared one evening, her voice hoarse with fatigue. "We have a synthetic version of your antibodies that works just as well against the plague virus." The room erupted in cheers, but Meredith could muster only cautious optimism. They had passed the first hurdle, but there were many more in store. The artificial antibodies would have to be tested, improved and produced in large quantities. These would have to figure out a way to get the treatment to infected regions, many of which remained in lockdown. The testing phase brought both good news and bad news. In the fight against the plague, the synthetic antibodies worked, but they needed a targeted delivery system. The treatment had to be delivered by 4, and it involved multiple doses over several weeks. It hadn't proven to be the miracle they'd been after, but it was better than nothing, even worse. The researchers also found that the antibodies were quite unstable and had a short shelf life. The treatment would have to be produced and distributed rapidly, and it would need a relatively advanced cold chain distribution system to remain efficacious. We're dealing with a huge logistics operation, Dr. Foster said in one of their planning meetings. We are trying to make millions of doses, spread them out over the world and give them to people who are not rarely in places that are hard to get to. Can it be done? Meredith asked. Yes, with the right resources and collaboration from governments worldwide. But that's also where we are going to face our most difficult challenge. Those responsible for locking you up in that building aren't going to let that go easily. They're going to fight us every inch of the way, as though summoned by her language. Their haven was violated the following day. Meredith was in the lab, giving blood for another round of synthetic antibodies, when the sirens wailed. Outside the window, she could see black SUVs around the building. They discovered us, Dr. Foster said, her voice strained with fear. We've got to get you out of here. But there was nowhere to run. The building was encircled, and armed agents poured through the doors within minutes. Meredith was forced to helplessly stand by as her would-be rescuers were charged and arrested. Their research seized and their hopes of but saving the world crushed under the sledgehammer of government morass. Morrison had come to escort her personally. His eyes were dead as he watched her lead out of the court in handcuffs. You've been quite a problem for us, Miss Chen, he said. I hope you know that your wonkerific little foray has taken us months and squillions of bucks, which would have been better spent trying to save lives. The only thing that is killing people is letting me rot in here, she wrote back, her voice steady, despite her fear. Those people were weeks from having a treatment available. You're condemning millions to death. We're being careful, Morrison said. We're being certain that any treatment we engage is safe and effective. Before we bring it out to the public, we can't waste your blood on untried theories. They transferred her to a new facility, one that rendered her previous prison akin to a vacation complex. This was deep underground, with many layers of security, no escape. They made no mistakes, and they learned from her previous breakout. But they had also studied Dr. Foster's research. Those synthetic antibodies were being honed and tested, but far more slowly than the private team had been working. Morrison's crew were cautious and methodical, and oblivious in every way to the urgency of it all. Months passed. Then years. Meredith sat in her cell and watched as the plague swept over the whole world, taking the lives of millions and turning regions into barren wastelands. The quarantine zones grew. Governments crumbled and civilization itself started to tatter under the weight of the pandemic. The synthetic antibodies were later perfected, but the treatment continued to be expensive and hard to make. Government, officials and other essential individuals had access to it though, as the general populace faced down the plague defenseless. The world was splitting in two classes, those who could pay for the treatment, and those who would be left to die. In the facility, Meredith was a bit of a celebrity, the staff referring to her as the woman whose blood had saved the best of the world while it died. She was treated well, put in comfortable quarters and given every indulgence, but she was fundamentally a prisoner. She was still the answer that could save everyone, and only being used to save a few. The world's governments tried to maintain control, claiming credit for the development of the new immunity treatment, but the truth was impossible to hide. The modified virus was spreading on its own, outside of any official distribution system. It was nature's own vaccine, carrying immunity to every corner of the globe. Meredith remained in her cell, watching the news reports of the plague's retreat with a mixture of joy and exhaustion. She'd done it. She'd found a way to save the world, but the cost had been enormous, and she wasn't sure she would ever be free to see the world she'd helped save. The end came suddenly. 6 months after the modified virus had first been released, the plague was declared officially eradicated, with no new cases reported anywhere in the world. The quarantine zones were being dismantled, and survivors were beginning to rebuild their lives. Director Morrison came to see her one last time, his face showing emotions she'd never seen before. "You did it," he said simply. "You saved the world." "We all did," Meredith replied. "It took all of us. The government is prepared to offer you a full pardon and a substantial settlement in exchange for your continued cooperation with our research programs." "I don't want your money," Meredith said. "I want my freedom. I want to go home." "Home doesn't exist anymore," Morrison said. "The Chicago quarantine zone is uninhabitable. The plague may be gone, but the infrastructure is destroyed. There's nothing left to go back to." "Then I'll make a new home," Meredith said. "Somewhere in the world I helped save." The release papers were signed that afternoon. After nearly 4 years in captivity, Meredith Chen walked out of the facility as a free woman. She was 23 years old, and she was stepping into a world that was fundamentally different from the one she'd known as a child. The planet was healing, but the scars remained. Entire cities stood empty, their populations either dead or relocated. The global economy had collapsed and was slowly rebuilding. Governments had fallen, and new ones had risen from the ashes. It was a world that had been broken and was now learning to be whole again. But it was a world that lived, and that was enough. Meredith made her way to the Scottish Highlands, where Dr. Mitchell had established a new research center dedicated to preventing future pandemics. The two women embraced like old friends, though they had spent only a few hours together in person. "How does it feel?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "To know that you saved everyone." Heavy, Meredith admitted. "I keep thinking about all the people who died while I was locked up, all the time we wasted, all the lives that could have been saved if we'd acted sooner." "You can't think like that," Dr. Mitchell said. "You did what you could with what you had. That's all any of us can do." They stood together on the hillside overlooking the research center, watching the sun set over a world that was finally free from the plague. In the distance they could see birds flying south for the winter, carrying with them the immunity that had saved humanity. "What happens now?" Meredith asked. "Now we make sure it never happens again," Dr. Mitchell replied. "We study, we prepare, we watch, and we remember what it costs to save the world. So we're ready if something like this ever threatens us again." Meredith nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. She'd saved the world, but the work wasn't done. It would never be done. There would always be new threats, new challenges, new diseases that could emerge from the depths of nature to threaten humanity. But she'd also learned something important during her years in captivity. She'd learned that even in the darkest times, even when all hope seemed lost, there were people willing to fight for what was right. Dr. Vale had risked everything to help her. Dr. Mitchell had traveled across the world to participate in their desperate plan. Pastor Wright had taken in a stranger and helped her find her way. The world was full of people like that, people who would stand up when it mattered most. That knowledge gave her hope for the future, even as she carried the weight of the past. She established a foundation using the settlement money the government had eventually forced on her. Despite her initial refusal, the Crimson Hope Foundation became a global network of researchers, medical professionals, and ordinary people dedicated to pandemic preparedness and response. They worked in the shadows, quietly building the infrastructure that would be needed if humanity ever faced another existential threat. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself, stronger and more resilient than before. New cities rose from the ashes of the old ones. New families were formed to replace those that had been lost. Children who had never known the plague grew up in a world that had learned the value of cooperation and preparation. Meredith never married, never had children of her own. She'd given everything to save the world, and she continued to give everything to protect it. She traveled constantly, visiting research facilities, speaking at conferences, and training the next generation of scientists and doctors who would carry on the work. But she was not alone. Dr. Vale had left government service and joined her foundation, bringing with him a network of researchers who had been sidelined by bureaucracy and politics. Dr. Mitchell had become like a sister to her, a constant companion in the fight against future pandemics. Pastor Wright, now in his 80s, served as the foundation's spiritual advisor, reminding them all of the human cost of their work. On the 10th anniversary of the plague's eradication, Meredith stood before the United Nations General Assembly to deliver a speech that would be remembered for generations. She was 33 years old, her hair now touched with gray, her face marked by the weight of responsibility she'd carried for so long. 10 years ago, the world nearly ended, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast hall. Not because of war or natural disaster, but because of a microscopic organism that turned our blood to crystal. We survived, but we didn't survive unchanged. She paused, looking out at the delegates from every nation on Earth. We learned that our greatest strength is not our weapons or our wealth, but our ability to work together when faced with an existential threat. We learned that the cure for despair is not hope, but action. And we learned that sometimes, the most important thing you can do is trust a stranger with your life. The speech was interrupted by applause 17 times. When she finished, the entire assembly rose to their feet, not just as a show of respect, but as a recognition of what she represented. She was not just the woman who had saved the world. She was the embodiment of humanity's ability to triumph over impossible odds. But for Meredith, the applause was not the end of her story. It was merely another chapter in an ongoing mission. After the ceremony, she flew back to Scotland, where the latest class of pandemic response specialists was waiting for their final training session. The plague is gone, she told them on their first day. But somewhere out there, in a rainforest or a melting glacier or a laboratory where someone is playing with forces they don't understand, the next threat is already taking shape. Our job is to be ready for it. She looked out at the young faces before her, seeing in them the same determination that had driven her to escape that first facility all those years ago. They were the future of humanity's defense against the unknown, and she was proud to be their teacher. The world ended once, she continued. We brought it back. If we have to do it again, we'll be ready. As the sun set over the Scottish Highlands, casting long shadows across the research centre that had become her home, Meredith Chen reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything, gained everything, and given everything in service of a cause greater than herself. The plague was gone, but the lesson remained. In the face of extinction, humanity had chosen to fight. In the darkest hour, when all hope seemed lost, ordinary people had done extraordinary things. A scared 19-year-old girl had become the key to salvation. A doctor had risked his career to do what was right. A pastor had shown kindness to a stranger. A researcher had traveled across the world to help save it. These were the stories that mattered, not the grand gestures or the dramatic moments, but the quiet choices that good people make when the world is watching and when it's not. The decision to help instead of harm, to trust instead of fear, to hope instead of despair. The world would face other threats, other challenges, other moments when extinction seemed inevitable, but it would face them with the knowledge that humanity had triumphed before, that hope was not naive but necessary, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is believe in tomorrow. Meredith walked back to her office, where files on 3 potential pandemic threats were waiting for her review. The work never ended, but that was as it should be. The price of survival was eternal vigilance, and she was willing to pay that price for as long as she drew breath. She had saved the world once. She would spend the rest of her life making sure it stayed saved. Outside her window, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, each one a reminder of the vast universe that surrounded their small blue planet. Somewhere out there, other worlds might be facing their own plagues, their own extinction events, their own moments of ultimate choice. But on this world, in this moment, humanity endured, and that was enough. The last immune had become the first guardian, and the world was safe in her hands.